Well, hello everybody. This is Brent Snavely. I am a senior director at Lambert and Company, and this is really our first roundtable for the automotive mobility practice from Lambert and Company. We are pleased that everybody is able to join today. We've got what I feel is a really good lineup of automotive journalists that we're going to be talking to today. With Mike Martinez of Automotive News, who is, of course, from a leading industry trade publication, Mark Phelan with the Detroit Free Press daily newspaper, and Mike Wayland with CNBC Digital, which is, of course, a national financial media organization. So a range of potential viewpoints of covering the auto industry. And I'd just like to ask each one of these guys to introduce themselves and say a little bit more about what you do, what you cover, how long you've been doing it. And I think I'll kick that off with Mike Wayland, and then we'll go from there.
Thanks, Brent. Yeah, happy to be on here, especially with Mike and Mark. I started covering the industry about 10 years ago. I've been with CNBC.com for almost a year now after working with Mike over at Automotive News and working above Mark at the Detroit News. And then before that, with MLive Media Group launching their automotive section. So kind of been in a few different roles, but covering GM, FCA, and labor relations mostly.
Very good. We'll move to Mike Martinez next.
Hey guys, happy to be here. I've been covering the industry since about 2014. I've been at Automotive News since 2016, covering Ford, the UAW, and Tesla. Before that, I was working with Mike at the Detroit News, covering Ford there as well.
And Mark?
And hi, everybody. I have been covering the auto industry pretty much my whole career. At the Free Press since 2002. I figured out how interesting and enjoyable it is early and did not see any reason to change into other areas. I'm basically, I am the auto critic and columnist at the Free Press. The Free Press has a full auto team of 3 other reporters and a couple of editors. Each of the big local companies has a beat reporter assigned to it. I get to freelance, write about really whatever I feel like. Generally with an eye toward what the products and the technology mean and how those things play into company strategy and which companies do well and which struggle.
Great. Thanks, everybody. So just to back up and to give everybody who's listening a recap of what we're doing here today and why we're doing it, just simply occurred to us at Lambert that a tremendous amount of things have changed in recent weeks and months, far more than anybody would have expected at the beginning of the year. That of course, has changed the automotive industry dramatically. And while there are many of these, webinars and discussions happening now because of the way everybody works, really, as far as I know, there's been very little, very little heard from the journalists themselves that are in the thick of things and in the middle of the industry. So that is really our goal here today, is to have a discussion broadly about automotive journalism, what this group of journalists is seeing, how their job is changing, and the changes they're seeing in the industry. So just before we get started, two kind of minor logistical notes. We did somehow wind up with Mike, and Mark. And in order to make things a little bit more clear as we go through this discussion, I'll be referring to Wayland, Martinez, and Mark. Secondly, we will have time. We are planning to have time for Q&A at the end. We will be taking questions. If you have a question on this platform, there is on your screen, there should be a section for live comments. You can just type your question in. We will be watching for those. And after about 25 to 30 minutes of a discussion here, we will move to Q&A. So with that, really, again, the focus, the original idea for this discussion was to talk about coronavirus, and how that has changed the industry. And but of course, there have been other additional troubling and rapid changes in the past 2 weeks or so in our nation. So I just wanted to address that first, and ask each one of our guests, how have the nationwide protests that have sparked out of Minneapolis with the unfortunate death of George Floyd, is that affecting what you are covering, and how your auto team is covering the industry and the news you're looking at right now? And I'll start with Mike Wayland for that.
All right. Yeah. Obviously, CNBC has been covering everything nationally. The death, the protests, the unfortunate riots happening. For the automotive industry, we've been kind of looking at it, just kind of how it's impacting different business, not necessarily the human toll. We have an entire team of political people as well as just general news reporters kind of looking at that. So just kind of seeing how this is going to change business. We saw letters from CEOs of all three of the Detroit automakers kind of talking about changes they'd like to implement and how change can start from within their companies. So we actually covered each one of those letters in the past few days. And personally, I was actually, it was very nice that they actually did send those letters to employees, because maybe 10 years ago or even further back in history, we might not have seen them weighing in like they kind of have in past few days as well as recent months regarding some of the events.
And how about Martinez? You and Automotive News has also covered those letters from the auto CEOs. What would you add to how Automotive News is looking at this right now?
Well, there is definitely an automotive angle to all this, from what Wayland said, with what the executives are doing and speaking up in their communications to their employees. And also, one of our core readers, dealers. There's been a lot of dealerships that have been forced to close, or in some cases that have been broken into during portions of some of these protests. So we've covered the impact. I believe there's more than 20 that we've counted so far that have seen damage, vehicles even stolen from dealerships and from lots. So we're monitoring that, and in cities with curfews, how that's affecting dealer operations just when things are starting to get back to normal, quote unquote, because of the coronavirus. And when they're finally able to have customers in their showrooms, now some of their hours are being impacted by statewide or citywide curfews. So we're monitoring that. But I do want to say, Brent, I am really awed and respectful of folks at the Free Press and the Detroit News and all the dailies who are on the front lines, covering these protests minute by minute. It's extremely honorable to see them continue to tell these stories, even in the face of pepper spray and tear gas and rubber bullets sometimes.
100%, Mike, definitely.
Yeah. That's a good segue over to you, Mark. And yeah, I have been watching some of the live feeds, especially from photographer Andy Wright, on the street. But how has this affected your team's coverage, Mark?
Actually, I can join wholeheartedly in the admiration that you both expressed, because the auto team thus far has not been all that involved. If this moves into something that affects the plants, we will certainly at that point get into it. If there's something more that the CEOs do as policies evolve, that we'll cover. But the unrest on the streets, we've got Mandy Wright, Mike Elrick, a great team of people who are out there every day doing magnificent work, and frequently getting shot at with rubber bullets and tear gas. I think we are actually the only newspaper in the country that may have had its executive editor tear gassed this week, because our boss Peter Bhatia went out to check when he had heard about a photographer who had fallen down and possibly injured themselves. And while he was looking into that, the gas came rolling in. So the whole paper is massively involved in it, but the auto team is more or less keeping an eye just on the auto industry right now and watching to see, does the ramp up that we were all expecting to begin this month, how does that come off?
Very good. Thanks for that feedback. With that, I think we'll move on, back to our main topic that we had planned to focus on. I just would like to hear from each of you, essentially, how has this era? I think we're all doing, even with this session right here, it's a video platform. But how has this era changed sort of your life, the way you do things as a reporter, and how you go about stories? And maybe I'll again start with Wayland, because we were chatting just before this started about attending court hearings by video. So tell us a little bit about that and what times are like for you right now.
Yeah, I mean, CNBC was really kind of early in a lot of the coverage regarding the coronavirus. We really started tracking it in mid-January, and I started writing about it in late January regarding the impact in China. And my editor, who leads the coronavirus coverage, actually was just all about watching this and covering it. And some people kind of were thinking that she was almost too much into it, that it wasn't going to come here, it was going to be kind of a hoax, and we saw that wasn't the case. So, I mean, since late January, we've been writing about it. I'd say late February, early March, until a couple weeks ago, that is all I've been covering, really, is coronavirus. And I think I mentioned in a previous conversation with Brent, as well as a few other people, that if it wasn't about coronavirus, we really weren't going to look into it that much or cover a lot of it unless it was really big breaking news or really impactful, just because the amount of people watching, and CNBC hit 1 billion page views, I believe it was page views during the coverage. And we just wanted to keep an eye on every single angle of that. And for automotive, that meant, I mean, tracking it from China to Europe, finally to North America. So it has really just dominated coverage. And right a week or two ago, kind of when we thought that we were going to be getting back to normal coverage, we've obviously seen that wasn't the case. And it's going to be interesting how we go forward from here. But I mean, at some point, we do have to return back to normal coverage and also continue keeping an eye on COVID, the protests, and everything else.
And Mark, how about your view of basically your coronavirus coverage versus other regular industry coverage, if there is any, and what's that balance like?
Well, the Free Press is running that really on two simultaneous tracks. My job when there's an emergency is to contribute to the coverage of that when I think I've got something unique to say, or when an editor asks, but also to try to make sure that there is some of the normal coverage of autos that's running in the paper. So new technologies, trends, new vehicles that are being introduced, things like that. So I'm doing a little bit of both of those. My colleagues, the three beat reporters, are all coronavirus all the time right now. They're looking at plant closings, they're looking at illness, they're looking at how the union and management is working together on this. One other thing that's worth noting for anybody who's trying to reach anyone in the Free Press, we and the rest of Gannett during the second quarter, virtually all employees are taking 1 week of furlough off each month to reduce costs without there being any layoffs. And that means that if you're reaching out to somebody at the Free Press, copy multiple people, because you don't know who's on and who's not. And also, please keep in mind that by definition, we are 25% understaffed at all times during this, because everybody is taking 1 month off each week. But we're doing our best to keep an eye on everything, and I think thus far being reasonably successful.
Yeah, and Mark, I'll just stick with you a little bit longer on that point, and talk about when you come back from furlough after being off for a week. What is that like in these kinds of news cycle cycles? How hard is it to get back up to speed? And then I'll have another quick follow-up after that.
I'm glad you asked, because that's a really interesting challenge, because on the one hand, there is so much stuff happening that you sort of need to hit the ground running. But on the other hand, the Labor Department laws that regulations that cover furloughs mean that we literally cannot even look at our voicemail or email during the week of furlough. So companies don't use it as a way to get uncompensated work. So you could spend a whole day just going through emails, and that's essentially a part of what I do in my first week. So I think all of us feel a little bit disconnected as we move back into it. But I have found I've been through 2 weeks of this now. After the first week, I felt like it took me longer to get up to speed than it did after the second week. So I think that it's something that we get better at as we go on. And there's so much going on, so many stories going on, so many things that need to be covered, that it's not like we're going to be sitting around wondering, what do I do next?
Right. So we have a lot of communications and media relations people, who signed up for this session today. And there's always the age-old question of, with a media pitch or invite of any kind, how often should we professionals follow up? And that can be annoying. What's your view right now on that, Mark?
I'm glad you asked that. And I know I'm going to regret saying this, but normally I believe if you send the pitch, if I don't answer, it means I saw your pitch and it didn't land. Follow-up questions, did you get my pitch, are not helpful. And as much as I feel that way, I have to admit that during this current period when there's so much going on, and particularly when I'm doing block deletes of emails that came in while I was on furlough, there have been a couple of follow-up emails that people sent that actually did turn out to be, stories that I wanted to look into. So I'm embarrassed to say that I'm giving contradictory advice. In general, one pitch is enough. Right now, there's so much going on that if you want to, send a follow-up, I will try hard not to, grumble when I see it. But more than that, I think is starting to feel like somebody's tugging on your shirt sleeve. I don't think there's much need for follow-up phone calls and stuff like that. Email is the best way to go still for me anyway.
Sure. And then just again to back up with Martinez, your general, what is your general experience of how you're balancing workload right now and how your team is as well? And I think, and maybe as part of that context, we have noticed that the Automotive News team has done a really diligent job of tracking plant closures and now plant openings. So just give us your perspective.
Well, we are lucky in that we have a very large team to help handle, some of the workload and that we're under, and it's a crazy amount. I think we're all, whether on the PR side or the reporter side, dealing with how to balance that work-life situation right now. Working from home, it's a heck of a lot easier just to stay on the laptop past 5 p.m., 6 p.m., however late you want to go, and to continue working. We're trying to track every angle, whether it's from the dealer side, how this is impacting operations there in terms of online sales, to how the supplier world is reacting. Many of them, quite frankly, fighting for survival and dealing with liquidity issues, to what's happening with the automakers and the union, to what's happening with product reveals. So we're trying to cover everything. I hope we're doing a good job in providing our readers a service. We feel like these are really obviously unprecedented times. There's no playbook. There's no plan for how to get through this. And I think our role as media is to help provide as much clarity to our readers as we can get at any given moment.
Thanks. And I think that's kind of a perfect segue. I wanted to kind of move more into industry trends now and get some viewpoints on what your thoughts are and how you're approaching covering those industry trends. You mentioned, Mike, I'll stick with you for a second, Martinez, the plant reopenings and restarts. Where do you think we are, from your perspective, where are we at in that arc? I know much of the industry has restarted, but where are we in that arc of plant openings and production restructuring, and the industry getting back to normal production versus some hiccups?
Well, we're smack dab in the middle of it. It's an ongoing story, and it will be for quite some time. From a number of different angles, you look at trying to reopen safely, and the number of positive cases that keep popping up in these plants, and we're seeing assembly lines halted for an hour, sometimes a day, to clean and disinfect when a positive case pops up. So we're trying to track how the automakers are handling that, and that may last for quite some time until we can get full rapid testing regimen in place. I know that's something the union, the UAW, has advocated for, and the automakers are working towards. And UAW President Rory Gamble has said we may be in this situation for the next year and a half, even until we can come up with a vaccine. So we're really, the same thing applies with all these suppliers as well. You can track if a supplier plant goes down, OEM assembly plants quickly follow. So we're really looking at how they continue to ramp up their staffing levels. A lot are just on one shift right now. Some are moving to 2 shifts in the very near future. And then how that impacts summer shutdowns, right? Plants normally go down for about 2 weeks. We've already seen Ford and GM say at some sites they're not going down because they need to make up that production. And then it flows on down the chain. What happens at dealer showrooms? Is inventory available if you want to go out and buy a car right now? Can you get what you want? So we'll be covering this for quite some time.
Wayland, I know you would be, you are writing about following much of the same thing. Any additional thoughts you would have on the industry as it restarts production?
Yeah, we're following it. Not as granular as Mike and Automotive News are. A lot of times we're taking the bigger kind of 10,000-foot view and making it for a broader audience, particularly investors and Wall Street, and just how it impacts the company's bottom lines. And I'd say overall, that's actually kind of what we do in general with the auto industry. There are a few things that, because of my background and because of what I've covered in the past, we've been covering a lot more things that CNBC necessarily wouldn't have covered in the past, including the hearing that we were just referring to regarding the former UAW president, Gary Jones. But overall, we're watching it, but really watching it from the perspective of how it's impacting, or how it might impact, the bottom lines of the companies, as well as kind of doing some featurey articles and how the ripple effect, such as suppliers or dealers or the rental industry, the coronavirus's impact on those sectors will kind of impact the overall auto industry.
Yeah, speaking of suppliers, both suppliers and the OEMs, had a lot of coverage early on about production of personal protection equipment, ventilators, and things like that. Are we largely past that news cycle at this point?
I would say so. I think the conversion process, and the fact that the president kept assaulting the companies for what they were doing or what they weren't doing, I think all of that is sort of baked into the story at this point. It would have to be something that changes the narrative to crack the ice.
And Mark, I'll stay with you for this next question to kick it off. I think you mentioned, and others did too. So we're also in an era right now of event cancellations. Starting with the Geneva Auto Show, and then New York Auto Show, and of course the North American International Auto Show have canceled their shows for this year. So just curious your perspective overall on how that will impact and is impacting the cycle of product reveals, what you're seeing, maybe what you think is working well as automakers do some of those on their own with videos, video chats, etc. And Mark, your thoughts?
Yeah, the cycle of product reveals has been decimated, basically. There were probably 7 or 8 vehicles that would have been introduced to the press for test drives and gone on sale over the course of the last 2 months that have not. There's a backlog building up in the pipeline that at some point is going to have to break loose. Thus far, there have been a few programs where people did Zoom conferences, basically, and that is better than not doing a presentation on the vehicle's features and technology and who the buyer is and all that sort of stuff. But it's no substitute for the way it normally happens, which is we spend a day or 2 with the team that did develop it. We ride in cars, we drive with them, we sit at dinners with them. So, I mean, right now, if you're covering product, you're doing it with almost one hand tied behind your back, because it's the access to the people and the vehicles at the same time that really inform, I think, the most useful coverage for people. We are just now seeing the beginning of some briefings resuming. Many of these things tend to take place other parts of the country because, in the winter you want predictable weather and so on and so forth. But I suspect that as we hit the height of summer and into the fall, because there's so many press in the Detroit area, we'll probably see automakers figuring out a way to do briefings and unveilings for vehicles to people here who at least don't have to fly, and they'll figure out the niceties of who wears a mask and how far apart do you set the desks as we get closer to it. But I think we will see more of that. There's a couple of embargoed briefings that are taking place soon, so we're beginning to see what I think by September, it should be almost a flood of vehicles that need to be introduced, because they can't. I mean, there are new vehicles that you're just losing money if you don't put them into production at this point, and there are dealers who want to sell them. So I think that it's a moving target. By the end of the year, I hope that they will have figured out a way that people can travel to get to these as well. But that's still very much to be determined. But there have been very few introductions over the last 2 months. I expect to see that pace pick up quite a bit.
And maybe, Wayland, I'll move next to you. I mean, you don't write so much directly about product and product reveals, but I know that you go to auto shows. Do you miss them?
Yes, I miss leaving my house, and I miss seeing all of your lovely faces. But yeah, I mean, we do cover the reveals, particularly highly important, highly profitable reveals, pickups. I mean, SUVs we covered for GM's full-size SUVs, and what I've been kind of seeing with Ford releasing information about the Mach 1 recently is that there is an appetite for people wanting to read about it. It's kind of a pent-up demand of readers kind of wanting to know about new products coming out. And I mean, we've been hearing about the Ford Bronco for 5 years now, Mike, somewhere around there. Yep. And it just keeps kind of getting delayed. And I think all the automakers, kind of how Mark said, I don't think it's going to be all digital. I don't think that kind of it's a supplemental thing. It doesn't replace being there with an executive, sitting there talking to them, being in the vehicle. You can't just kind of get yourself into the vehicle and learn about it by just looking at it. You actually have to be there, touching it, talking to people who know about it. Well,
and I'll ask you a quick follow-up too, Mike, which is, I would think, this is the one thing that I expected you to say that you didn't say. I would think that for you, all of that's important. Seeing the product up and close and personal is important. But the FaceTime and direct access that you get at an auto show, you're not going to get on a video reveal.
No. And Brent, I mean, sitting there in a room with an executive at each of the auto shows during auto show season, you gain a rapport with them. You get to learn how they act. You get to they get to learn how you write and what you are going to ask about. And it helps out with the reporting process. And I mean, in every single job that I've had, the access to the executives and being able to directly talk to them is far more important than getting into the vehicle. but getting into the vehicle does still help and does kind of help you write about that product. But yeah, the access to executives is far more important, at least for my standpoint, than kind of being in the vehicle.
Sure. And then Martinez, I think this is an important topic that everybody wants to hear about. So I'll stick with you and would love to hear your perspective, and the perspective of Automotive News on, on these event cancellations and show cancellations, and and your perspective on the type of reveals that you're seeing and getting now.
It is a paradox because on one hand, our jobs are kind of similar in business, automotive journalism. We can, continue to make the calls, that we need and do the interviews we need by phone, whether it's from our home or office. But at the same time, you're missing a whole heck of a lot by that face-to-face interaction and being able to pull people aside or network or whatever that may be. So not being able to go out and see the cars face-to-face and talking to executives face-to-face is a bit of a struggle. That would be my one ask from the PR folks here, is that, try to be as transparent as possible, try to offer, the access to the executives, whether it's a Zoom call or whatever that may be, because that's still really important, even if we can't sit there and shake their hand, to at least be able to have that time with them that we otherwise would. So it's difficult. I think we're all trying to adapt to these new video reveals. And I think we're going to see that a lot moving forward, at least until next year, until we get into this next round of auto shows again.
Yeah. So, and Martinez, I'll stay with you because I think that's a good segue. What I'm going to do now is essentially move to some audience questions that we've been getting as we've been having this conversation. You just provided some important insight there that the access to executives is still really key for you, and that it's not just about showing the product, that having an interview of some kind with an executive for the story that's relevant for you is really critical. So anyway, one of the audience questions was, what kind of media pitches are you interested in right now, if any, that are not specifically COVID coronavirus recovery related?
Well, there is an appetite, as Waylon said, for quote unquote normal, product news or technology news. Our readers still crave that, the normal day-to-day stuff, week-to-week stuff that we would cover in print. We still have room for that. So please continue to send those pitches. One area we are really focusing on as we get, towards the end of the immediate crisis is, moving ahead, what have we all learned from this, and what innovations have been unlocked in this crisis? How are your companies, whether or not they're a technology startup or a 100-year-old automaker or supplier, what are they doing differently? What can they take from this to become a leaner, more efficient company, whether that's, different work from home strategies or cost, controls, or, new things going in vehicles, whether it's, Ford released something about heating the inside of police cars to kill the coronavirus. Others have talked about antimicrobial type surfaces. Will that become a trend? And obviously, as you get into technology and ride sharing and ride hailing, what are the impacts on that? So we're really looking to see what has this crisis spurred from the minds of everyone at these various companies.
That's a great segue. I'd like to go back to Mark to extend this question. Mark, I know that I worked with you, and you're an auto critic and you predominantly write about product, but you recently did a story focused on suppliers, about supplier technology that is actually COVID related. I was wondering if you could talk about what that story was, and then have you also answer the question of, are you interested in any non-COVID story pitches right now?
Absolutely, and thank you, because that feeds beautifully into the point I was going to make of this. The story was about, some research that indicated that people are interested in personal vehicles because they think they are healthier, easier to clean, so on and so forth. I was talking to a few different suppliers about what are the things you're investigating to, convince people that their vehicles are clean, to have self-disinfecting cars, virus-proof cars. So I spoke to a company that does UV treatment of surfaces. They were talking about maybe doing UV lights inside the channels for the air conditioning ducts, to clean the air that's going around. Fogging. Companies building stuff that would, when you're out of the vehicle and the vehicle is empty because you need a motion detector so you don't accidentally poison a dog, you fog the inside of the car with hydrogen peroxide, which will kill things. So that was, one example, and that's a great example of the kind of story I'm always interested in. And particularly right now, because as I said earlier, when we're in a crisis, there's a need for some stuff in the paper that is not about the crisis, because people need a break, as Mike was just saying. People are interested in cars and technology as well. So my kind of thumbnail description is anything that a person would say, really? Or, gee, how'd that work? Is something that I will at least consider as a topic for a column. And that can be technologies, that can be features, that can be, surprising new business directions. But I mean, just something that, if you got home at the end of the day, you might say, you'll never guess what I found out today. That's my threshold for, more or less all columns.
And Wayland, would you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, and just kind of to hit on a few of the other questions more in broad that I've been watching kind of pop up. For CNBC, unless you're an automaker, major OEM, public major company, getting a standalone story or something of that nature about a company or a product is difficult. It's not like Automotive News that covers the industry in depth and covers every aspect of it. I mean, we're covering on a broader level. So a lot of times I'll get pitches or different things, whether it's coronavirus or not coronavirus related, saying, please write about my company, please write about my product. And a lot of those, there's so many that, like Mark said, I honestly, it'd be a lot to respond to every single one. But a lot of times I do remember certain pitches or certain products, and then I go back to them. And I will include them in a feature story or include them in a trend story. And that always helps. And knowing what companies you represent and what technologies are out there help out. And just because I might not respond to every email or might not respond to every pitch, just having them in the inbox does help quite a bit when you kind of, let's just say post-COVID, and you're thinking about stories to write, and you kind of remembered seeing something and you can go back to it and then contact. I've done that several times. I mean, since joining CNBC, included smaller companies that necessarily wouldn't be covered on CNBC in with a trend story that includes a lot of auto suppliers, some happier stories, some not so happy, like during the union strike of GM, as well as kind of the supplier story impacting COVID. And it really did surprise me how many companies just wouldn't even talk about it or didn't even want to mention it. So I had to go back to public filings and calls. I mean, just being able to have access always helps out as well.
Great insight. We're going to soon be running short on time, so I just want to get this question out, which is, it's June. It's June 3rd right now. We're halfway through the year, even though it might have felt like 3 years so far already. What's kind of your outlook for the next 6 to 8 months? Can you tick off 3 or 4 big trends that you believe you will be covering, writing about, watching closely for the remainder of the year? I'll start with Phelan.
Well, I mean, I'll take the easy one first then. Does the recovery happen? I mean, that's what we all need to know. More specifically, will the sales trend we've seen so far, with people spending a lot of money, the people who can buy cars are spending more money on vehicles, often because they're financing them for longer, but prices are going up. Pickups in particular, but also SUVs are doing well. Will that continue to be the case? There was a lot of thinking early on that this would be like the Great Recession, where people downscaled what's smaller vehicles briefly in reaction. That doesn't look to be the case. Will that happen? And will the automakers be able to manage the recovery? Automakers and suppliers, because one supplier with a plant that shuts down can close four assembly plants. So will the industry be able to manage the recovery in terms of keeping the plants going, keeping workers healthy? I think those are the two big ones that I'm going to be watching.
And Martinez, your thoughts about back half of the year?
I'd say taking a look at how investments are affected. Obviously, the financials of all these companies will be closely monitored, but also what are they doing? In terms of electrification, in terms of technology, autonomous, self-driving vehicles. Those have been big topics for years now, and they could stand to drastically change, after what we've been through the past couple months. And I think, getting to another question, another thing we're watching is, the car buying process, right? How that is changing, I believe, permanently, right? We were all moving towards online sales for quite some time. We all know traditional dealers can be slow to change, but this is prompting everybody to do that. They're forced to change now. And I think a lot of these online sales techniques are here to stay.
Yeah. And Wayland, what are your 3 or 4 big trends that you'll be watching the remainder of the year?
Personally, number one is getting my kids back to daycare, as they're crying right now upstairs. The second is a haircut, much shaggier than I have been in a long time. But regarding coverage, just to build on what Mike and Mark said, CNBC is very interested in emerging technologies, whether that be autonomous vehicles or all electric vehicles. So we'll continue to watch that, and that's actually what I've been kind of looking into as we're coming out of this. And as I mentioned, as we're coming out of this, also just what trends have actually changed and how businesses have actually changed and whether they've actually changed. We cover an industry that is very reluctant to change. And while they might speak big about certain topics, following through is very important, and to kind of watch how the companies are doing with that and whether or not more employees are working from home or anything of that nature. Those are kind of just to touch upon what Mark and Mike said.
Okay. Real quickly, and maybe it's my fault because I didn't ask enough questions about it, but you guys all just touched on it, but autonomous vehicles and mobility has been less of our conversation just now than I think any of us would have dreamed at the start of the year. So what autonomous vehicle, mobility, EV stuff do you want to write about, or are you looking for right now?
I'll go first because I'll say
go ahead, go first. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I think that the focus on a couple of crises has, I think, caused us to look at autonomous vehicles in a more realistic way. We all, because we cover the industry closely, we knew they were not around the corner, but we often covered them as if they were. I think that for me, and I think for our readers' interest, they've receded considerably. They're something that will happen. They're going to be very important. They'll be huge for commercial vehicles, of course, but as far as autonomous vehicles for individuals, that has slipped way down on the list of interest that I'm seeing from the data we get on what people are reading and the like.
All right. I will. One thing I may not have mentioned in the beginning is our goal here was to go about 45 minutes. We're coming right up on that, on 45 minutes for this session. We'll go a little longer just with the answer to this question. We started off talking about the protests that are occurring nationally and the all of the things associated with that. I mean, and the automotive CEOs have spoken up. What about supplier companies? And I guess how would you gauge or weigh any kind of media pitches related to anything that is tied to jumping into that kind of a story, and how, I guess, how dangerous is it to be tone deaf to pitch stories like that? I'll throw Wayland into that for the first answer.
I'm not going to comment directly on the tone deaf. I think that's more of a PR expertise on when to pitch and when not to. But I mean, I'm always open to getting pitches, and I mean, overall, just go back to the other comments that I said. For suppliers to get kind of single coverages, it has to be something pretty special. It has to be a larger public company, and it has to be pretty good access for a lot of things. But if you think your company has the best of something and it is actually a trend, and going back to Mark's point, I mean, we've written a lot about autonomous vehicles. I was in my first autonomous vehicle 7 or 8 years ago, and I remember thinking it was amazing. And some of the technologies are just kind of turns of the screw. And I think a lot of suppliers think that they are the best thing since sliced bread, and they want coverage on them. They want individual coverage on them. And the consumer doesn't necessarily care about it. They care about the end game. They care about the vehicle it's going to go in. And just trying to relate supplier coverage to some of the more larger events going on, I think will assist in coverage, and it'll assist us, I mean, in having more relevant pitches if you can relate it to a bigger topic or a bigger event going on that might be impacting some of the larger OEMs.
Mark, do you have any additional thoughts there?
I would echo the latter part of that. I think that I honestly think that this is hugely important for companies in terms of internal communications, how you communicate with the people who work for you. But if you're not a big company that everybody knows by name, there's not going to be that much general interest unless you're doing something that's really extraordinarily different or effective. And yeah, in all honesty, a lot of the things coming even from big companies, feel like we have to say something, so I'm going to say something. What can I say that nobody will remember tomorrow? I thought that, Mary Barra's letter to employees and dealers over the weekend, I thought that was one of the few that actually felt personal and heartfelt, and like there was real motion that could take place from it. If your CEO is just going to do a release that says, our thoughts and prayers are with whoever needs our thoughts and prayers, don't expect much of a response.
Great perspective. Martinez, any additional thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I'd say at least from the supplier realm, I personally haven't seen anything that I don't want to, not give credit to somebody who has, but I personally haven't seen it. I know we are working, anecdotally on something for our Monday issue, just a type of roundup story on the response to the protests. So if you do have something from one of your companies, feel free to send it along. I think most of you probably know our suppliers reporter, Alexa St. John. She covers that. But to Mark's point, I think, it has to be genuine. It has to, if there's some action item, as for whether it's a donation or speaking with certain networks of people, something your executives or your company is doing concretely that would certainly help in terms of our coverage.
Great. Hey, well, again, I want to thank each one of you guys for taking the time to join us today. I think we covered a lot of ground. I'm hoping we provided the audience with some really good perspectives. I feel like we did. So once again, thanks. And I'll remind those who joined in and listened that we will have a replay of this discussion available on our website at www.lambert.com. And with that, again, I will wrap up and thanks everybody. And we really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.